On a warm summer evening, John F. Kennedy Jr. took off for what should have been a routine flight to Martha's Vineyard. John had flown this route 35 times before, but unfortunately this time would be different, and he crashed when he was only a few minutes away from his destination, tragically killing everyone on board the plane. The reason why he crashed has been the source of endless speculation over the years. That's why I'm going to share with you the untold story of JFK Jr.'s fatal plane crash and the shocking sequence of events that led to this tragedy. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Our story begins on the evening of July 16, 1999, when John F. Kennedy Jr. was planning to fly his wife Carolyn and her sister Lauren from the Essex County Airport in New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard. They were going to drop off Lauren before continuing the flight to Hyannisport to attend a family wedding the following day. Unfortunately, they had no idea of the danger ahead. As John began his descent towards Martha's Vineyard, something went terribly wrong. The aircraft turned right and began descending, then veered left and climbed. John never made any radio calls for help, and moments later their aircraft spiraled out of control into the ocean below. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was only 33 years old when she died in the crash. She was a publicist for Calvin Klein, and her relationship with John quickly became the target of the paparazzi and the media, which put a strain on their marriage. Lauren Bessette was only 34 years old and is often the forgotten victim in this tragedy, which is why I'll explain her significance later in the video. John F. Kennedy Jr. was only 38 years old when he died, and he was the pilot flying the plane. He was the only son of President John F. Kennedy, born just weeks after his father was elected president. He earned a law degree from New York University and was well known for his charm and charisma. He was also the founder and editor-in-chief of George, a political lifestyle magazine. One of the things investigators first looked at was John's experience and training as a pilot. We know that he started receiving flight instruction in October of 1982, and over the next 6 years, he flew with 6 different instructors and logged 47 hours of flight time, but only 1 hour of that was flying solo. Now, critics have argued that this was a sign he wasn't a good pilot, but keep in mind that John was only 21 years old when he started flying, and my guess is that between going to college and growing up as a Kennedy, he probably didn't have the time or perhaps the maturity to commit to training consistently. That's probably why he stopped flying in 1988 and he wouldn't start again until 9 years later. In December of 1997, he attended training at Flight Safety International down in Florida, and over the course of a 4-month period, he logged 53 hours of flight time, including 10 hours solo, earning his private pilot license in April of 1998. The instructors that he flew with didn't have anything negative to say about him or how he handled training. After getting his license, John spent a lot of time flying a Cessna 182 and continued receiving instruction from a local flight school and various instructors. Over the course of the rest of 1998, John logged about 179 hours of flight time, including 65 hours with an instructor. In March of 1999, John passed the FAA's written instrument exam, and then he returned to Flight Safety International to begin more training to earn his instrument rating. John's primary instructor during his instrument training said that his progression was normal and he had all the basic skills needed to complete the course. John completed about half of the lessons before he left the flight school on April 24, 1999, about 3 months prior to the crash. During that training, John logged over 13 hours of flight time with an instructor and almost 17 hours of simulator time. Now, I think he made the decision to leave the school because he knew he could continue his training using local instructors back home, and he just didn't have the time to hang out down in Florida and finish the program. He had to get back home to run his magazine and take care of his marriage and everything else going on in his life. One of the biggest changes that happened when John got home that we need to talk about is the fact that he purchased a new airplane. Before we talk about the new plane and what happened during the flight, I want to talk about something else that's really important to me. Today's video is sponsored by Aura, and the reason why you need to pay attention is because the odds of you dying in a plane crash are only 1 in 11 million, but your odds of falling victim to online crime are 1 in 4. If it hasn't happened yet, it could very likely happen to you or your family because hackers may have stolen the social security number of every American. Over 2.9 billion records were stolen from national public data, which provided personal information to employers and others doing background checks. Those records include a person's name, address, date of birth, phone number, but most importantly, your social security number, all of which have been released online for free. This should be a huge wake-up call. You've never been more vulnerable online than you are right now. That's why I trust Aura to help protect me. Aura monitors your personal data, including your social security number, across billions of data points like the dark web to detect and alert you to potential identity theft. They also give you up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario happen, and they have a bunch of other features to keep you safe online, and it's all inside one app. That's why I highly recommend right now you go to my link at aura.com/pilotdebrief to try it free for 14 days. That's enough time for Aura to find out if your personal data is exposed. If you want to protect yourself and your family, go to aura.com/pilotdebrief to try it for 2 weeks for free. The aircraft that John was flying when he crashed was a 1995 Piper PA-32 Saratoga II. This is a single-engine, low-wing aircraft often used for business trips, and John purchased it on April 28, 1999, just 4 days after leaving the instrument flight school, which is about 2.5 months prior to the crash. One of the features included on the aircraft was an autopilot that could hold altitude and heading. However, some pilots reported that the system required active management and could become challenging during high workload situations. According to the investigation, John flew the Saratoga with at least 3 different flight instructors. One instructor flew 3 flights with him, including a flight to Martha's Vineyard with IMC conditions for the approach. That instructor said John's skills and ability to handle multiple tasks while flying were average for his level of experience. A second instructor flew with John to Martha's Vineyard on July 1st, just 2 weeks prior to the crash. That flight was conducted at night and also in IMC conditions. During the flight, John reportedly had no issues using the autopilot. The third instructor made 6 or 7 flights with John to Martha's Vineyard and said that most of those flights were conducted at night. He also said that John had no trouble flying the plane, and he was very cautious about his aviation decision-making. However, that instructor also told investigators that on 1 or 2 occasions, the airplane's autopilot would turn to a heading other than the one selected, which required the autopilot to be disengaged and then re-engaged. He didn't think the problem was significant, and it's worth pointing out that he also didn't have anything bad to say about John's ability to use the autopilot. Eventually, the investigation determined that in the 15 months before the crash, John had flown about 35 flights to or from the Martha's Vineyard area, and about half of those flights were without an instructor, including at least 5 at night. Additionally, John had logged about 310 hours of total flight time, with 55 of those hours being at night, and about 72 hours as pilot in command without an instructor on board. John also had about 36 hours in the Piper Saratoga, of which 9.4 hours were at night, and 3 hours were without a flight instructor. However, of the 3 hours without a flight instructor in the Piper Saratoga, only 0.8 were flown at night. The bottom line is, even though John was very familiar with the route to Martha's Vineyard, he had very little experience in the Piper Saratoga and even less flying that aircraft by himself at night. And now that you understand a little bit more about John's background, we need to talk about some of the contributing factors to the crash. There were at least 4 big issues that I think played a role in this crash, and when you look at each of them individually, they might not seem like a big deal, but each one of them represents a slice of Swiss cheese in the risk model, and when all of the holes line up with what else happened on the flight, it creates a scenario that almost guarantees a tragedy. The first factor is that John fractured his left ankle during a paragliding accident on Memorial Day weekend, and his cast was removed the day before the plane crash. The reason this is important is because witnesses said he was using crutches while he was loading luggage onto the plane. Although it was up to John to determine if he was fit to fly, the pain from that injury could have been a big distraction. The second factor that could have played a role in this tragedy was stress. John and Carolyn were going through marriage counseling, and Carolyn didn't want to go on the trip. They argued about it, but eventually she decided to go so that way they could avoid media scrutiny. On top of that, John's magazine, George, was struggling financially, reportedly losing about $4 million a year. That's why I'm sure the pressure he was under could have easily preoccupied his thoughts during the flight. The third factor is that John attended a Yankees game the night before the flight, and he hung out with his friends after the game. Allegedly, he didn't get back to his hotel until around 2 a.m., and he probably only had about 5 hours of sleep and had been awake for over 12 hours when he started the flight. The problem with this is that flying fatigue can easily lead to poor decision-making and loss of situational awareness. The fourth contributing factor to this tragedy that we need to talk about was the timing for when they took off. The flight was originally scheduled to depart Essex County between 6 and 6:30 p.m., and sunset was at 8:22. Because the flight time was only about an hour and 15 minutes, that meant the original plan had them landing at Martha's Vineyard about 30 to 45 minutes prior to sunset. Unfortunately, John ended up working late, and then he had to go pick up Lauren, and they got to the airport around 8 p.m. Carolyn was also delayed due to traffic and didn't arrive until 20 minutes later, which was right at sunset. That meant instead of flying during the day, they'd be flying during the darkness of the night. And although John was legal to fly VFR at night, this can be very challenging for someone that doesn't have a lot of experience, and you're about to find out why this is so dangerous. But first, there's one more contributing factor that we haven't talked about yet, and that's the weather. John got a weather briefing about 2 hours prior to takeoff, at which time Essex County had clear skies with 4 miles visibility due to haze. Martha's Vineyard also had clear skies with 6 miles visibility due to haze, and Hyannisport had few clouds at 7,000 feet with 6 miles visibility due to haze. Unfortunately, this was based on observations made at 6 p.m., and John didn't take off until 2.5 hours later, and the visibility was gradually getting worse because of the haze. One of the pilots that landed at Essex County just before John took off wanted to warn him that the visibility was worse than forecasted, but he was unable to find him and never got the chance. However, the truth is that even if John had gotten the updated weather just before takeoff, it was still VFR conditions, and that meant he was legal to conduct the flight. That being said, just because something is legal doesn't always mean it's a good idea. You need to understand that night flying is very different from day flying, and it demands a lot more attention of the pilot. The biggest difference is that it's harder to see outside visual references, and you have to rely on your flight instruments a lot more to control the aircraft. To make matters worse, on the night of John's flight, the moon was just a sliver in the sky and provided almost no illumination. This is a very dangerous situation, especially when flying over large bodies of open water, because sometimes those lights on the water can look like stars, and it's very easy to lose sight of the horizon because it can blend in with the water, especially in a very hazy environment. Unfortunately, if John had taken off when he originally planned around 6 p.m., the flight would have been during the daytime, and this tragedy most likely would have been avoided. Instead, John was probably feeling the pressure to make the flight happen, and all the holes in the Swiss cheese were lined up, and he took off around 8:38 p.m. As John took off into the night sky, the controller instructed him to make a right downwind departure. John acknowledged the controller, and that would be the last radio call he would ever make. He departed to the northeast, initially staying below 2,000 feet, before climbing up to 5,500 feet for the cruise portion of the flight. John was probably comfortable for most of the flight because his cruise altitude most likely kept him above some of the haze, allowing for greater visibility. Now, this could have given him a false sense of confidence that the visibility would be good at a lower altitude, even though he'd be in the middle of the haze. As John headed out over the water, I'm sure he could see the haze below him, obscuring some of the lights. And that's why the safer option would have been to point back towards land, and that way he could fly directly over the coastline until he got a lot closer to Martha's Vineyard. Instead, John continued to head on a direct path towards the island, and when he was about 34 miles from the airport, he began his initial descent. During the descent, John began a right turn to the south, and then about 30 seconds later, he stopped the descent at 2,200 feet and began a climb back up to 2,500 feet, continuing to the southeast away from Martha's Vineyard. Unfortunately, that turn put the shoreline directly behind him and left him staring at a dark and empty ocean. Additionally, because the haze had reduced the visibility to only about 2 miles where he was at, he most likely couldn't see the horizon or any semblance of land to know which way was up or down. About 50 seconds later, John began a left turn and climbed up to 2,600 feet before beginning a descent at a rate of 900 feet per minute. A few seconds later, he reversed the turn back to the right, and the bank increased to over 45 degrees. As he continued to descend, the airspeed increased to over 180 knots, and eventually the descent rate exceeded 4,700 feet per minute as the aircraft spiraled down into the ocean, killing everyone on board instantly. Now that you know how they crashed, we need to talk about why and the two most shocking parts of this entire story. There has been a lot of debate and speculation about what happened in the final moments of John's flight. Some critics have argued that the aircraft got too slow and it entered a right spin, and John was unable to recover because of that injury to his left ankle, preventing him from being able to apply full left rudder opposite the direction of the spin. However, the NTSB ruled out this scenario because the data they had showed that what happened was a graveyard spiral. This is when a pilot is disoriented and thinks they're flying wings level, when the reality is they're in a descending turn. The pilot will often notice the altitude decreasing as the airspeed increases, and they pull back on the controls to begin a climb and slow down, but because they're in a turn, all this does is tighten the turn, increasing the airspeed and the rate of descent until they hit the ground. Regardless of the reason why John became disoriented, the weather conditions that night made it extremely challenging, if not impossible, for a VFR-only pilot to fly over the water, and John didn't have enough instrument training or experience in the Saratoga to handle the situation. Although John could have used the autopilot to help him recover and maintain level flight, the NTSB determined that the autopilot wasn't in use at the time of the crash. The shocking truth, though, is that if they weren't dropping off Lauren at Martha's Vineyard, then the flight to Hyannisport would have been almost entirely over land, and John probably could have maintained visual reference to the horizon because of all the cultural lighting. Additionally, one of John's instructors had talked to him earlier on the day of the crash and offered to fly the trip with him, but John replied saying that he wanted to do it alone. We'll never know why John rejected that offer, but the bottom line is that John was the pilot in command, and that means he was the one responsible for the safety of the flight. Even though his disorientation is what caused him to crash, he never should have taken off to begin with. I appreciate you watching this video, and I hope you were able to learn something from this debrief. If you did and you want to support the channel, be sure to watch one of these other videos on your screen, and thanks for your support.